Joining us right now to talk more about that is former chief strategist for Texas Senator Ted Cruz's Senate and presidential campaign. Jason Johnson is with us, along with former Deputy Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration, now a senior fellow at the University of Virginia Miller Center, Chris Liu. Good to see you both, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
So, Jason, in that same interview, the Treasury Secretary made those comments about the market. He offered this, an absolute guarantee that a tax overhaul would be signed into law by the end of this year. Is that a reasonable timetable? Do you think they will get this done?
Well, certainly if you look at the performance this year with other major pieces of legislation, it doesn't seem reasonable, but I understand why the Secretary is saying what he's saying. There is an absolute expectation that this has to be done in the political market, if you will. And so I'm not incredibly optimistic that it happens by the end of the year. There certainly seems to be a mixed message coming from some leaders on the Hill as to whether or not the deadline is the end of the year. But whether it's the end of the year or after the first of the year, it must happen.
Chris, do you agree with that it must happen and that it will happen?
You know, I agree with Senator McConnell, who said it's more important that we get it right instead of just ramming this through. And I think it's important to look at the details here. And we don't really know yet what percentage is going to go to the super wealthy, how it's going to add to the deficit, whether it's really going to fix the idiosyncrasies in the tax code right now. And so putting it on an artificial deadline does not bode well for coming up with good policy. And that's really what the market wants to see right now. They really want to see the once-in-a-generation tax reform proposal, not another giveaway that just goes to the super wealthy.
Yeah, Chris, considering it's Kevin Kelly here, considering you spent time in the White House, especially with President Obama, do you think it's appropriate for cabinet secretaries or anybody in this administration to be talking about the impact on stock markets, given that they should be focusing on policy and talking about the implements, what it could do to the real economy, as opposed to really focusing on markets that should do whatever they should be doing?
That's exactly right. It's one of the reasons why we in the Obama administration didn't talk about the stock market, even though we had significant gains as well, because the market goes up and unfortunately it goes down as well. And it goes up or down for reasons that have nothing to do with Washington. And if I were Secretary Mnuchin, I would probably take my cues from the leaders on the Hill as to what the timing should be.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. But at the same time, $5.3 trillion in market value doesn't come out of air. It's clear that the market value that we've seen in these gains is partly due to optimism over what President Trump is doing. He's rolled back an incredible amount of regulation, and they're expecting tax reform. Are you saying $5.3 trillion in market value is just a coincidence?
Well, I would say that it's based on the expectation something's happening. This is a recovery, economic recovery, that began in early 2010, and we've had essentially 7 straight years of economic growth. There have been rollbacks of regulations, but there hasn't been the significant economic change that Donald Trump has promised yet.
Well, we did see a 3.1% GDP the other day, and GDP was averaging about 1.5% under President Obama. So, I mean, there's something to it that the economy is definitely getting better. You're knee-deep in small business. Do you see that, Mike Murphy? Do you see things getting better?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We see small business optimism out there. We see startups. We see companies that are looking to disrupt existing industries coming out, hiring people, raising money, going out, creating, using technology to make our lives better. So I think right now the optimism that we see nationwide is something we haven't seen in a long time.
Jason, let me ask you this. In terms of this bill, if it gets done in the first quarter, do you think that still has a positive impact? Or if we don't see a bill on the president's desk by Thanksgiving, this is going to be a problem for certainly into the 2018 election for the Republicans?
Sure. Going back to the comment earlier that we shouldn't, have artificial deadlines, I don't believe getting this done by the end of the year or saying that we need to get it done by the end of the year is an artificial deadline, because we know historically that very few things happen in election years. And as we all know, next year is an election year. So, Maria, into the first quarter, maybe so. But we know that you get much past the first quarter, these guys don't like to do much in an election year.
Yeah, and you're right. If they don't get it done, maybe that's, they should move out. Because this is something that the American people want. Leah Gabriel.
Yeah, Chris, Senator Schumer said our Republican friends are trying to hide what's in the tax bill, that they don't want people to know. Is this just resistance sort of popping up already from the Democrats on this, obstructionist? Because really tax reform is good for all Americans right now, isn't it?
100% agree tax reform is good. What we have seen so far is simply tax cuts. And some of the initial estimates are that between 50 to 80% of the benefits would go to the top 1%.
That's not true. That's just not true. I don't want to spew out nonsense because the top 80% of the tax reform package going to the top 1% is nonsense.
An important issue to get right, for instance, is the state and local tax deduction, which is going to affect a lot of Republican members. And understanding the details of that is not just resistance. It's actually trying to make sure that this is legitimate tax reform. And there are so many of these issues. This is why this is hard, and it's hard to get right.
You're talking about a corporate rate of 20%. If you see the corporate rate go down from 35% to 20%, that will be a positive for corporations. And the idea is that they are going to reinvest in higher jobs.
Right.
Small business with a 25% pass-through rate, same thing, down from 39.6. So this is a significant move. He's also talking about 3 brackets: 12%, 25%, and 35%.
And small businesses
doubling the standard deduction.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that those aren't Republican small businesses. Those are Democrat, Republican, American small businesses. So that impacts everybody, not just one side. This isn't a one side versus the other.
And the reason that I have to push back on that, Chris, is because we were expecting the talking points after this plan, and it's just not true that 80% of the tax plan impacts the top 1%. It's just not true.
You know, the problem is we don't have the details yet. We don't have the details yet, and I think that's the problem.
We have the details that we just mentioned. We got 3 brackets on the individual rates. You got a doubling of the standard deduction, corporate rate of 20%, pass-through rate of 25%, and the elimination of most deductions.
Well, look, we don't really know what the impact is on average Americans. We don't know what the size of the child tax credit's going to be. We don't understand all the other archaic idiosyncrasies.
So then how can you say it benefits the 1% if you don't even have the details?
Look, the folks that have looked at this are basing this on the initial proposal. Let's have a full debate on this, and let's make sure we get this right.